They used to say that the winners write history, a commentary on the universal human tendency that when writing history, it turns out rather conveniently that the winners tend to be seen as the good guys and the losers tend to become the bad guys. But now, with political correctness all the fashion, score one for the underdog. In a brilliant PR strategy, the winners and losers have been flipped. The losers are now the good guys, and the winners are the bad guys. Of course, anyone with any familiarity with human nature or human history tends to suspect that both approaches are whitewashing things a bit and simplifying the truth. The reality is more complex than the generalizations. Indeed, Marxist philosophy is out of touch with human nature, not really understanding human psychology, but instead seeing people as groups or types, not individuals. There's a reason I'm mentioning this on Columbus Day. You'll read a blizzard of accounts today of how awful Columbus and the Europeans were and how saintly the Indian tribes were. Because the faults of the Europeans are adequately addressed elsewhere by the critics, I would like to point out that the claim that the Indian tribes were all universally peace-loving people who never touched a hair on anyone's head is hogwash. Human history is nothing but one war after another. Certainly, one needs only to look at European history to come to this conclusion. But if you study North American history, you'll discover that the Indian tribes also fought countless brutal wars among themselves long before the Europeans arrived. In some cases, some tribes were completely exterminated by opposing tribes. Human nature being what it is, this doesn't surprise me. And the Indian tribes didn't go down without a fight against the European newcomers. A fight that lasted at least a century or two. Various Indian tribes fought on both sides of the Revolutionary War since they were politically savvy and sought to align themselves with the European power whose position was most advantageous to themselves. Early accounts of European settlers in Pennsylvania and Virginia, which I've read in the course of doing genealogy research, discuss the fear that families, and I do mean families, not armies, lived in. Early accounts of European settlers in Pennsylvania and Virginia, which I've read in the course of doing genealogy research, discuss the fear that families, and I do mean families, not armies, lived in. They never knew when the Indians might attack, and usually lived near a fort where they could try to run for protection. As a defensive measure, houses, cabins, were built with low roofs so that if the Indians got inside, they couldn't swing their axes overhead. Plenty of European settlers met gruesome deaths at the hands of the Indians. The Indians were brutal, killing men, women, and children. They scalped people and burnt them at the stake. Notwithstanding that, it is interesting to note that some white settlers taken captive by the Indians eventually assimilated into the tribes and later refused to rejoin white society when given the opportunity, though some obviously did choose to leave. In 1755, Captain Charles Lewis wrote while passing through Hampshire County, Virginia, quote, "I was this day very curious in the examination of the mischief done in the house, and was much shocked at the havoc made by the barbarous, cruel Indians at McCraggan's. I found the master of the family, who had been buried but slightly by his friends after his assassination, half out of the grave and eaten by the wolves, the house burnt, the cornfield laid waste, and an entire ruin made." William Henry Foote describes an attack on Captain James Moore's family and the survivors being taken into captivity by the Indians after most of the family had been killed. Quote, "The morning of July 14, 1786, saw the family in App's Valley full of life and cheerfulness. The sun went down that day on smoking ruins, the dead bodies of the father and 4 children, and the journeying of the mother with 3 children, helpless captives too, they knew not what, in the western forest. After the horrible events of the morning, perhaps the mother wept not, when the captors, dissatisfied with the delicate appearance and slow traveling of her weak-minded and feeble-bodied son John, dispatched him at a blow and hid him from the sight of the pursuers. The hour of night passed slowly and sorrowfully as the 4 captives, all female, lay upon the ground, each tied to a warrior who slept tomahawk in hand to prevent a recapture should they be overtaken by the pursuing whites. Of this, however, there was no danger. The rapidity of the retreat forbade all prospect of a recapture. But on the 3rd day, a new cup of sorrow was put in the mother's hand. The little infant Margaret, that Mary could not part with, was spared to the mother. The Indians even insisted in carrying it. On the 3rd day, the little one became very fretful from a wound it had received on its cheek. Irritated by its crying, a savage seized it and, dashing its head against a tree, tossed it into the bushes without a word. The company moved on in silence. The sisters dared not, the mothers would not, lament the fate of the helpless loved one. Perhaps they pitied the living, reserved for they knew not what, more than the dead, whose last bitter cup on earth was drained. Of course, some say that the early European pioneers deserved any mistreatment they received from the Indians, since the Europeans were trying to settle in an area that belonged to the Indians. So one could say that the Europeans were illegal immigrants in America. But we face the issue of illegal immigration today in America, and the politically correct crowd normally calls for forbearance, granting immunity, citizenship, and rights, not death. Even the most die-hard conservative Republicans, who might favor deportation or building a fence between the U.S. and Mexico, would not advocate attacking or killing illegal immigrants as a sound policy recommendation. Finally, I will point out, as plenty of others have done, that there is no such thing as Native American. Scientists say the human race developed about 200,000 years ago in Africa and spread out around the world. So everyone in the U.S. is African American, and no one is Native American. The Indian tribes were simply African Americans who arrived earlier than the later European African Americans. A reminder that no one really owns the land. It is simply held by one group until another group comes along and takes it. That is the lesson of history. It is not a minor point that Columbus's opening up America to European settlement also paved the way for the modern world's longest-lasting democracy, a society that is free and critical of what others have done before it. And that is a point worth celebrating, and let us hope we learn from their mistakes.